Think you could survive in the Wild West? Well, you may have to think again. Forget the Hollywood version of the Wild West. This place was a nightmare. Everything out there was just waiting to kill you. Outlaws, disease, wild animals, even a bad poker hand. One wrong move, and you were done. There were no hospitals, no second chances, and definitely no mercy. Your days were numbered, whether it was the weather, a vengeful gunslinger, or just plain bad luck. So, before fantasizing about being a cowboy, let's see how long you'd last. Here are 10 things in the Old West that would have sent you to an early grave. Attacks by Native American tribes. Now, let's get real. If you were a settler, cowboy, or prospector in the Old West, one of your biggest fears was getting caught by a Native American war party. And let's be clear, this wasn't some random villain arc. Settlers were rolling into indigenous lands completely uninvited, taking over land, destroying resources, and breaking treaties left and right. Naturally, the native tribes fought back. Raids were brutal, and many settlers didn't survive them. The Apache, Comanche, Lakota, and Cheyenne were among the most feared warrior tribes. And if they considered you a trespasser, your chances of survival weren't great. One of the most infamous Native American raids? The Fetterman Massacre of 1866. Captain William J. Fetterman and his 80 soldiers thought they could take on the Lakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne warriors in Wyoming. Big mistake. The warriors, led by Red Cloud, ambushed them and wiped out the entire unit in under an hour. And don't even think about being a stagecoach, driver, mail carrier, or lone traveler. Native scouts knew the land way better than you, and if you got caught out in the open, you were done for. Some settlers were captured, scalped, or tortured, while others were simply left to rot in the wilderness. Even the U.S. military struggled to fight back. Custer's last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 was a perfect example. General George Custer thought he could charge into a Sioux and Cheyenne village and win. Instead, he and his entire unit were slaughtered. You got kicked in the head by a horse. Would your biggest problem in the Old West be gunfights or starvation? Well, you may be wrong, because all it took was one bad step behind a horse and boom, lights out. Horses weren't just transportation. They were life or death. If you didn't have one, you weren't going anywhere. But if you didn't know how to handle one, you were walking around with a loaded cannon on 4 legs. A horse's kick could shatter your skull, snap your neck, or leave you paralyzed. And in a time when medical care was non-existent, even a minor head injury could mean a slow, painful death. Plenty of real-life cases of people getting their heads caved in by their own horses. Cowboys, ranchers, and even some unlucky city folk. If you spooked a horse at the wrong time, that was it. There are no second chances. The famous gunslinger Wild Bill Hickok's dad, William Alonzo Hickok, died after being kicked in the head by a horse. That's right. One of the most legendary gunslingers ever lost his father to a rogue hoof. And don't think you were safe just because you weren't a cowboy. Even kids weren't spared. Many pioneer children who worked on farms got too close to an irritated horse and learned firsthand why you never stand behind one. A sore loser took his revenge on you after a poker game. One of the most underrated but common ways people were sent to the afterlife in the Old West was losing or winning the wrong poker game. You see, gambling wasn't just a way to pass the time in saloons. It was serious business. And if you won too much or even looked like you were cheating, someone was bound to take it personally. Saloon poker games often ended in gunfire. Forget walking away with a pocket full of winnings. Half the time, you'd be lucky to walk away. Take Wild Bill Hickok, for example. This guy was a legendary gunslinger and a skilled gambler, but even he couldn't escape the fate of a sore loser. In 1876, while playing poker in Deadwood, South Dakota, Hickok got shot in the back of the head by a man named Jack McCall. Why? Because the day before, Hickok had cleaned McCall out at the poker table. McCall took his loss personally and came back the next day to put a bullet in Hickok's skull while he was still holding what's now called the dead man's hand, aces and eights. And Hickok wasn't the only one. Many cowboys, drifters, and even respectable townfolk met their end over a bad poker game. Cheating accusations could get you dragged out back and shot. Winning too much money could get you stabbed or beaten to death. One wrong look, boom, you're a goner. Saloons in places like Dodge City, Tombstone, and Deadwood saw more poker-related killings than most battlefields. The rules were simple. Play smart. Play fair. And if you win too much, consider leaving town immediately. You caught an STI from an escort and didn't treat it. All right, let's talk about something that definitely would have gotten you killed in the Old West. But nobody ever wants to bring it up. STIs. Yep, the Old West was basically a walking petri dish of diseases. And if you had a little too much fun at the local brothel, you were rolling the dice on your life. There were no antibiotics. If you caught syphilis, gonorrhea, or chlamydia, your options were painful, humiliating, and completely useless treatments like mercury ointments, injecting silver nitrate, or drinking straight-up poison in hopes that it would kill the disease before it killed you. But guess what? None of these treatments worked. Doc Holliday, for example, you know the legendary gunslinger and gambler from Tombstone? The guy who helped take down outlaws at the OK Corral. Well, rumor has it that Doc caught syphilis from an escort when he was young, and it wrecked his health for years. Some believe it even played a role in weakening his immune system, making his tuberculosis even worse. And let's not forget Alfred Packer, a prospector turned cannibal, yes, really, who supposedly suffered from advanced syphilis by the time he was arrested. His nose and lips were rotting off because the disease had eaten through his flesh. STIs weren't just an inconvenience. They were a death sentence. If you didn't get treated, and let's be honest, treatments were useless, you'd slowly go insane. Your body would start falling apart, and you'd probably get locked up as a madman. You climbed the gallows as punishment for your crimes. If you thought you could roll into the Old West, rob a few banks, rustle some cattle, or shoot a man over a bad poker game without consequences, maybe you are not far from wrong. Because back then, justice wasn't slow, and it definitely wasn't kind. If you got caught breaking the law, you weren't getting a long prison sentence. You were getting a one-way trip to the gallows. Public hangings were a form of entertainment in the Old West. Townspeople would dress up, bring their kids, and watch criminals dangle as if it were some kind of carnival event. There were no long trials, no appeals. If the sheriff or judge thought you deserved it, you were going up those steps. Take Tom Blackjack Ketchum, a notorious outlaw who made the stupid mistake of robbing a train in 1899. He was caught and sentenced to death, and when the big day came, the executioners miscalculated the drop. Instead of just breaking his neck, the force completely tore his head off in front of a screaming crowd. Imagine being there, expecting a normal hanging, and instead, you get a full-on horror movie. Then, there was the case of the Innocence Gang in Montana. These guys were a nightmare, robbing and murdering travelers all over the region. But when the vigilantes finally caught them, they didn't waste time. In one night, they hanged 5 gang members at once because, well, efficiency. Even famous outlaws weren't spared. Billy the Kid was supposed to be hanged before he escaped jail, only to get shot later. The Dalton gang was nearly wiped out in a botched bank robbery, with the survivors facing execution or life behind bars. The best part? You didn't have to be guilty to end up on the gallows. If you looked suspicious, had the wrong friends, or were in the wrong place at the wrong time, a lynch mob could string you up without asking questions. You died in a drunken duel. Ah, the classic Old West duel. Two men facing off, hands twitching toward their guns, but here's the thing. Half of these duels were probably just drunk guys with too much pride and bad decision-making skills. Seriously, throw in some whiskey and a bad attitude, and you were just a step away from an early grave. It wasn't just the high noon showdowns with legends like Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday that made headlines. Oh no. In the Old West, just about every saloon fight could turn into a fatal gunfight once alcohol entered the picture. You'd have two cowboys hammered out of their minds on rot-gut whiskey, arguing over the silliest things, a card game, a girl, or someone looking at the other's hat incorrectly. Then, before you knew it, boom, they were drawing pistols and firing at each other in the street. Take the story of the infamous drunken duel between Billy the Kid and a man named Joe Hill. It wasn't a planned showdown. Billy was just in a saloon, enjoying some drinks, when Hill, probably as tipsy as Billy, started mouthing off. The argument escalated, and just like that, a drunken duel broke out between the two men. Being the quicker draw, Billy shot Hill in the saloon. 1 second, they were just chatting. The next, a man was dead. And don't even get me started on the notorious gunfight between Wild Bill Hickok and a cowboy named Butt Phil Coe in the streets of Deadwood. Both were reportedly 3 sheets to the wind when the fight broke out over a gambling dispute. Wild Bill got shot in the back of the head during the scuffle. It wasn't exactly a fair fight. They were both sloshed, and it didn't help that people around them weren't exactly the best aimers either. But it wasn't just outlaws or cowboys. Regular townsfolk were just as likely to end up in a drunken duel. All it took was one bad night at the local saloon, and before you knew it, someone was getting shot in the foot, in the gut, or worse, the head. Got attacked by an animal. In the Old West, animals were just as deadly as any outlaw. And they didn't care if you had a shiny badge or a good reputation. From bears and mountain lions to venomous snakes and even the seemingly docile horse, a run-in with the wrong animal could send you straight to the afterlife. Let's start with grizzly bears, the West's undisputed kings of animal mayhem. These beasts weren't just lurking in the forests waiting for hikers. They'd charge at you out of nowhere. A bear attack could become a real threat if you were in a small town or a ranch. The legendary frontiersman Jim Bridger was one of the few who lived to tell the tale after getting mauled by a grizzly. This was no ordinary attack. Bridger survived using his trusty knife and sheer willpower. Still, that bear's claws were a one-way ticket to the grave for most others. Then there were mountain lions. These sleek, silent predators were notorious for stalking and attacking cowboys, pioneers, and anyone who ventured too far into their territory. A mountain lion attack could happen while you are camping or riding. These predators loved to ambush from trees or rocks and weren't afraid to take on even the toughest cowboys. One unfortunate soul who found this out the hard way was a trapper named Isaac J. During a routine trip, he was ambushed by a mountain lion, and while he fought back bravely, the big cat tore through him, leaving him for dead. And of course, let's not forget rattlesnakes everywhere, from Texas to Arizona. A single bite could kill you before you even knew it was coming. These snakes loved to hang out in the tall grass, under rocks, or near streams, just waiting for someone to walk too close. Many cowboys would fall victim to these sneaky critters, especially if they weren't paying attention. One of the most famous stories was of a cowboy named John Snakebit Gage, who spent days in agonizing pain after being bitten by a rattler, only to eventually die from blood poisoning because the treatment was little more than wishful thinking. The harsh weather got you. You thought surviving outlaws, wild animals, and deadly duels was hard? Try battling Mother Nature in the Old West, where the weather was as merciless as the toughest gunslinger. Extreme temperatures, violent storms, and unpredictable conditions could easily take you down, sometimes faster than a bullet. In the summer, the heat could be brutal. The Old West, especially Arizona, Nevada, and Texas, saw scorching temperatures that could rise above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius. Imagine being on horseback for days, covered in dust, with no shade, no water, and nothing but the blistering sun beating down on you. It was enough to make even the toughest cowboys start seeing things. But the heat wasn't the only issue. Dehydration and heat stroke were serious threats, and if you didn't have enough water or supplies, you could die from it. The story of Francis Buster Brown is a chilling example. He was traveling across the Arizona desert when his water supply ran out. He tried to make it to a town, but he succumbed to heat stroke before he could get help. Then there was the cold. The Old West could get extremely cold in the winter, especially in Wyoming, Colorado, and Montana. If you didn't have proper gear, a snowstorm could leave you stranded, freezing to death in the middle of nowhere. Hypothermia was a very real risk. Cowboys often had to deal with sub-zero temperatures, making staying warm or starting a fire nearly impossible. One cowboy, Hugh Freezing Wilson, tried to survive a brutal snowstorm without proper clothing, and his body was found days later, frozen solid. Imagine thinking you had a tough day and then realizing this poor guy had been out there freezing to death without a hope of survival. And let's not forget the violent storms, dust storms, tornadoes, and flash floods. They were more common than you'd think. These sudden storms could whip through towns and camps, tearing apart houses and killing anyone caught outside. A flash flood in 1889 in the Texas Panhandle swallowed up an entire town and killed dozens of people who were caught off guard. It wasn't just tornadoes that could wreck your life. The wind alone could take down structures, and without a roof over your head, you were exposed to the elements. Die from an epidemic. Think outlaws and gunfights were the biggest threats in the Old West? Nope. Disease was out here, dropping people faster than any gunslinger ever could. You could be minding your own business, trying to survive, and suddenly, boom, you've got cholera, smallpox, tuberculosis, or typhoid fever. And guess what? There were no real cures. One of the biggest killers was cholera, and it spread like wildfire through contaminated water. If you drank from a dirty well, or even just touched something an infected person had, you were basically done for. Cholera outbreaks were so bad that entire wagon trains and towns could be wiped out in days. In 1849, during the California Gold Rush, an epidemic of cholera killed thousands of miners who had come west seeking fortune. Instead, they got a one-way trip to the grave. Then, there was smallpox, possibly the most feared disease of the Old West. Smallpox didn't just make you sick. It disfigured you and left you covered in painful, oozing sores. And if you were lucky enough to survive, you'd be scarred for life. Native American tribes were hit especially hard. as they had no immunity to the disease brought over by European settlers. In 1837, a smallpox outbreak nearly wiped out the entire Mandan tribe in North Dakota, reducing their population from around 1,600 to just 125 people. Imagine waking up one day to find nearly your entire town wiped out. That was the brutal reality of smallpox. And let's not forget tuberculosis, aka consumption. This disease was everywhere. You'd hear someone in the saloon coughing their lungs out, and chances were they weren't just sick, they were dying slowly. It could take months or even years, but you were done once it got into your system. The infamous gunslinger Doc Holliday, best known for the gunfight at the OK Corral, spent most of his life battling tuberculosis. He coughed blood constantly, struggled to breathe, and had to self-medicate with whiskey and laudanum just to function. And if that wasn't bad enough, typhoid fever was another deadly nightmare. It spread through contaminated food and water, and once it hit you, you'd be stuck with high fever, diarrhea, and severe dehydration until your body gave out. In 1880, an outbreak in a Colorado mining town left dozens dead in just a few weeks, and the worst part. There were no hospitals, no real medicine, just suffering and slow death. To make things worse, hygiene in the Old West was a joke. People rarely bathed, doctors didn't understand germs, and if you got sick, your best bet was some questionable miracle cure, which usually contained opium, mercury, or alcohol. That's right, they were literally poisoning people in the name of medicine, dying peacefully. If you were lucky. Now, let's be honest, dying peacefully in the Old West was about as rare as a teetotaler in a saloon. If you made it to old age without getting shot, trampled, infected, or frozen to death, you were basically a miracle of human survival. But even then, death wasn't exactly gentle. First off, medical care was practically non-existent. If you got sick or injured, there were no modern hospitals, no real doctors, and certainly no fancy painkillers unless you count whiskey and laudanum, which were basically the same thing. If you were lucky, you might get treated by a doctor who, in reality, was probably just a guy with some questionable herbs and a rusty saw. And let's not forget that people aged fast in the Old West. Life was rough. If you managed to live past 50, you were officially an old-timer, and your body was likely worn down from hard labor, poor nutrition, and a lifetime of dodging death. Most elderly folks in the West didn't just pass away in their sleep. They died from infections, untreated diseases, or even just sheer exhaustion. Take Buffalo Bill Cody, for example. He was one of the toughest frontiersmen of his time, but even he couldn't outrun death. By the time he passed in 1917, he was a shell of his former self, weak, sick, and completely dependent on doctors who really had no idea what they were doing. And he was one of the lucky ones. He actually got to die in a bed instead of on the dusty plains riddled with bullets. But if you really beat all the odds, lived a long life, and somehow didn't end up swinging from a rope or getting gunned down, congratulations! Your biggest worry was probably dying of natural causes, which in those days could mean anything from an untreated tooth infection to simply collapsing from overwork. And even then, dying peacefully wasn't the end of your troubles, because now your family had to figure out what to do with your body. Fancy funerals were a luxury. If you lived in nowhere, your final resting place might be a shallow grave behind the barn. If you were lucky enough to die in town, you might get a proper burial, but only if someone cared enough to pay for it. Otherwise, you might just end up in a mass grave, forgotten by history. So, yeah, if you somehow managed to live a long life and die of old age in the Old West, you were practically a living legend. Surviving the Old West wasn't about being tough. It was about being ridiculously lucky. If the gunslingers didn't get you, the diseases would. If the weather spared you, the whiskey-fueled duels wouldn't. So, next time you romanticize the cowboy life, remember, you probably wouldn't have made it past breakfast. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to like and subscribe.